Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today titled Mythbusting False Positives. I'm excited to have Dan DeMarco here with me hosting the webinar. I am Amy Knock, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know more about how the webinar will run. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be available for you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation today to answer any viewer-submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your question, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. And that concludes my brief introduction today. I will now pass it over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate that. And thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. Really very much do appreciate it. As you maybe can see from my rather busy title slide here, this is a talk that is based on a talk that I gave for the 2020 IAFP conference, and that was called "Guilty Until Proven Innocent." And in that particular talk, I tried to draw this sort of tortured analogy between presumptive positives and the presumption of innocence, in sort of legal jurisprudence. So that part's been stripped out. I think it was more confusing than it was helpful or enlightening. So that's been taken out. A number of other things have been kind of moved around and changed, and I think it makes for a much more crisp presentation. I think it's more up to date as well. So hopefully y'all like it. It's also a little bit shorter, which I think is good for everybody. So if I can advance my slides here. Which they're not wanting to advance. There we go. So I thought we would start with a little poll, an audience poll. The first time I've done this, but hopefully this works out okay. But I'm asking a question: true or false? And it's the rate of non-conforming presumptives, so-called false positives, in food pathogen diagnostics, primarily PCR, has increased significantly in recent years. So true or false? So there should be some sort of a poll thing popping up, I think, on your screen where you can actually answer that.
Yeah, yes, and I have gone ahead and launched the poll. So we'll go ahead and give it just about 20 more seconds here. It looks like there's quite a few responses that are coming in here.
Excellent. I mean, I know my answer. I'll share my answer. We're doing a whole discussion about it today, but I'm quite curious to see what the percentages actually end up being here.
All right, so we are at about 30 seconds here. And Dan, are you seeing the responses to those?
I can't see the response. No, I cannot see the responses. So if you could just let me know what are the percentages.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read those to you. So we had 75% said true and 25% said false.
Interesting. That sounds about right. And certainly I hear it, in my role here with Eurofins, I hear this almost every day about non-conforming presumptives and grumbling and complaining about it. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit about that issue today. So initially, when I pulled this presentation together, I wanted to answer that question. Really true. Is that really true or false? I mean, I know it feels that way. And certainly 75% of the people in the audience, it sounds like, say that it feels that way as well. But the way something feels is not always an indicator of what the way things actually are. So I wanted to actually to answer that question by going into our database here. So we have, as a third-party testing lab, obviously a major, massive database of data related to pathogen testing. And I wanted to go in there and answer this question. It turned out, really, it just was not possible to do that. The size, the complexity, the client confidentiality concerns, all those things came into play, and it just wasn't possible to answer that question, unfortunately, to answer it definitively. Hopefully, though, what I did pull together today will be just as informative, if not maybe quite as data intensive. A couple disclaimers first. So this presentation is a mix of fact and educated opinions. So there's definitely some opinion in here, but mostly fact. But in all cases where it is opinion, these are my own. They're not necessarily shared or endorsed by Eurofins or EML. And I'm going to be, when I talk about presumptive positives today, I am specifically referring to it as it relates to PCR in food pathogen diagnostics. However, that said, the principles are mostly applicable to other rapid methods beyond PCR and even other sectors like clinical diagnostics, for instance. So, as I said, the presentation is a mix of scientific and historic fact and also my opinions. And obviously, I think these are correct, but what I call the opinion hypothesis still applies. So I have been in research for a long time now, I guess 25 years or so. And one of the things that we do every day, or I do every day, is hypothesize. We generate hypotheses. It's obviously a core element of the scientific method. But I also take this a step further, and even in my life outside of work, I like to hypothesize about things, various things that I see, and I like to try to kind of formalize those things. So the opinion hypothesis is one of many of these hypotheses that I've developed over the years. And it basically describes the correlation between the strength of one's belief and the correctness of their opinion and its actual correctness. And if you actually look at it in terms of the formula, this is the formula that I came up with. And F here in this formula is actually the Freud factor, which is variable. And that's basically the size of one's ego. So basically the relationship is inverse. So as OB increases, so as the belief in the correctness of one's opinion increases, its actual correctness value decreases. And the value of F, so that the person's ego alters the shape and slope of that curve. So at F max, where you have a really big ego, strong opinions are virtually certain to be incorrect. And that's in the plot there, you can see what it looks like. And I say, if you look at kind of the characteristics of the curve, most people, most opinions and our beliefs about their correctness kind of live in that, what I call the circle of life, not very strong in one way or the other. And then I have here what I call the ego inflection point, and that's where basically you transition from a self-confident professional to an egotistical jerk or blowhard begins. And I call that the Neil deGrasse Tyson barrier. For those of you who know Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think it fits very appropriate. All right, so agenda. So we've had the brief introduction there in the opinion hypothesis. I'm going to go through some definitions of some important terms, and I think we need to be grounded because there is some controversy maybe about some of these definitions. I'll talk about what makes a result presumptive, and then I'm going to talk about what I think is probably the most interesting part of the talk, which is the history and the origin of the term itself, presumptive positive, in food pathogen testing. Where did it actually come from? And then I'll compare and contrast false positives and non-confirming presumptives. So these things are actually very different. And then I'll generate some more hypotheses again about non-confirming presumptive rates. So why are we seeing this supposed increase? And then I'll show a bunch of data. I say some data, but it's actually quite a bit of data that I think is relevant and quite interesting. And then I just close with some questions, and not a whole lot of answers, unfortunately, but a lot more questions in areas that could be looked into. So in terms of terms and definitions, so just a few. I could have put a lot more definitions here, but I just wanted to share a few so that we're all kind of on the same page. When I say positive, this is a result call by a PCR or a qPCR instrument or the platform or the algorithm specifically, and it's most often represented symbolically with a plus sign. The important thing to remember about a positive result is it does not necessarily mean the sample is positive. I know that sounds crazy, but it is actually the case. Okay, the term positive is used when we refer to these results, but we never actually report the term positive. Okay, we only report a sample as detected if it's been confirmed or not detected if it fails to confirm. Presumptives or presumptive positives. A presumptive positive is a positive result on a PCR qPCR test, so that plus sign, but it must be confirmed by a secondary method before the result can be reported as final. Okay, presumptive results are always computer or algorithm based. The confirmation is a secondary test, and it's almost always, in this case, cultural, and it's used to verify or confirm that the original result was correct. Okay, and confirmation, in contrast to a presumptive result, always requires some sort of human interpretation or human judgment. I'm going to skip over false positives and non-confirmable presumptives because I go into more detail on this later. And I'm going to move into what exactly it is that makes a given result presumptive. So why are some test results considered presumptive, whereas others are considered, sort of final and not needing any kind of additional confirmation? Well, there's different classes of reasons. There's sort of legitimate, what I call legitimate reasons. Performance is the biggest one. So for instance, the method, the sensitivity or specificity or its robustness is different. It's either inferior or sometimes maybe it could even be superior to what is considered the gold standard. Okay, another example here would be a multiplex PCR where you have multiple targets, both of which are needed to give a positive result, but they could be found in different organisms in the same enrichment. So STEC is a great example here with STIX and EAE. You also have defensibility results. So this is improper sample prep, lab contamination, misidentification during analysis. All these things can happen. So a further verification of that result gives you a more defensible result. And obviously that's super important when you're talking about regulatory actions that are demanded from some of these results. You can also have a new or unknown science. So if for instance, not enough's known yet about the target, or how they actually behave in the real world, and so you don't have a lot of confidence in the results. SARS-CoV-2, great example of this in the very recent past. Then there's sort of these, what I call debatable or other reasons. So you might say the result could be misleading. Okay, so dead cells, DNA or RNA in the case of PCR, shouldn't present a food safety risk in and of itself. And therefore you could say you need a secondary method to confirm the presence of live cells, which is actually what you're trying to measure is risk. Now, of course, there's strong arguments to be made that the presence of pathogen DNA suggests pathogen was there at one point. So whether to say there's no food safety risk there, I think is a bit too strong. And then there's sort of what I call the political or legal or optical reasons. Okay, so a positive result, a detected result on a C of A or whatever, it would just look bad. Okay, the person, the individual, the entity could be exposed to legal, regulatory, or political risk. And these reasons really should never be okay. But can you say you can't necessarily say they're always illegitimate. Again, I come back to SARS-CoV-2 here. There's some significant implications to saying there were at the very beginning of the pandemic to saying I detected SARS-CoV-2 versus saying a presumptive result. So in that case, and mostly that's sort of a optical. I can't say necessarily that it's always illegitimate, although it should never really be okay. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the history of the term. So where exactly did this term come from in food pathogen diagnostics? I wish it hadn't come out. It's got me nothing but many, many sleepless nights and a lot of headaches, but is here. And so the question is, where did it come from? So in 1992, the present day, what's now the present day IAFP, which then was the International Association of Milk, Food, and Environmental Sanitarians, convened an expert panel. And they convened that panel to discuss this new technology, what was not really new. It was already 7 years old at the time, but it was considered new for food. And this was PCR. And there was a lot of concerns here. There was concerns about the sensitivity of the method compared to culture. That it would be more sensitive, and also that it would detect dead cells, as I mentioned. And so industry was really worried about a big increase in positives, and therefore, a lot more lawsuits, higher costs, etc. So presumptive positive was appropriated from clinical diagnostics where it had been in heavy use. And we proposed that, and they commissioned a study to examine the data, all the available data. And the results showed that PCR was just only slightly more sensitive than culture, and that detection of non-viable cell DNA was, quote, unlikely to occur, given the sample preparations procedures used and overall method sensitivity. All right, so they came to an agreement. So industry regulators and the manufacturers all came to an agreement, which said basically from now on, all foodborne pathogen PCR tests, results, and possibly other rapid tests are to be reported as presumptive until they're confirmed by an alternate, accepted, validated culture method. So this is sort of this is how I imagined it in my head. I actually, going into this, as I began this research, I really had no idea what the origin of the term was, and I was quite curious. And this is basically what I had in my head imagined. But depending on your political leanings, maybe you might remember it a little bit differently. So you could say in 1992 there was a cabal of industry insiders, test kit manufacturers, complacent regulators, and sympathizers from the International Association of Milk, Food, and Environmental Sanitarians convened a so-called expert panel to rubber stamp the approval of a radical change to how food pathogen test results are to be reported. The high sensitivity of PCR sparked industry fears that the true level of pathogen contamination would be known, and they would demand costly changes. And so rather than call a positive result positive, they came up with this term presumptive. They stole it from clinical diagnostics, basically to appease the industry fat cats. And there were no studies or data analysis at all conducted to support the decision. So that is a rather dark vision. So in truth, of course, as most things, it really was not neither of those things. Okay, it wasn't the one extreme, and it certainly wasn't the other. So the idea to use PCR in food pathogen diagnostics was actually born at Qualicon. I'm sure many of you on the phone are familiar with DuPont, DuPont Qualicon, and they commercialized the first gel-based PCR assay for the detection of pathogens in food, which was for salmonella in 1994-95. Hard to believe how long ago that actually was. So I actually worked for DuPont for Qualicon for many, many years, and I was able to talk to one of the original founders, Pete Rosinski, and my former boss and former director of R&D, George Tice, who was also one of those there at the very beginning, and asked them about the origins of this term. And so just for information, George is a winner of the American Chemical Society's Heroes in Chemistry Award in 2002. They received that award for bringing PCR testing to the food industry. And Pete and George did both give their permission to be quoted directly for this and gave their final approval over what was presented or what is presented here. So when I asked them about this sensitivity question and where the industry so-called fears, this is what I heard back. Not sure I would call it fear. There was some apprehension. There was not much issue with PCR being more sensitive. Customers wanted a more sensitive test, but much like today, speed to result was a driver. Some things never change. On this question about dead cell detection, this concern of dead cell detection, they said they used math as an argument. They didn't really worry about dead cells. The way that if you do the math and the way the sample prep is done for their method, you would need 40,000 copies in a 25-gram sample. So unless protocols have changed, don't see how this could be the cause of widespread positives today. They did think about detecting dead versus living, but they don't remember any studies. Right about all PCR methods being equally sensitive, we showed could detect one organism. So in terms of the regulators and industry and any kind of coordination or communication between them, so you had the USDA Outbreak Lab was using PACS, but they couldn't do anything until they had a culture confirmation. The Kraft was an early development partner, and a BACS positive early on the release would be culturally confirmed, but as their confirmation rate approached 100%, they would act on that BACS result. Even if a BACS positive was not confirmed, they still would stick with BACS results for the disposition of the product. And there were many discussions of these issues with customers and regulators. So here we go. This is kind of the end here, and really the final answer, which is, what about this requirement for confirmation and the actual origin of the term presumptive positive? So we had George saying his recollection was that presumptive positive was driven by mistrust in new technology. Don't remember any regulatory input, but there was a lot of back and forth with AOAC. We tried to make the case that BACS was more accurate. A BACS positive did not need confirmation, and an action could be taken solely on that result, but a BACS positive became a presumptive positive to distinguish from a positive obtained using traditional culture methods. And then Pete said, we went through the AOAC validation process. We got a lot of pushback to claim BACS required no confirmation. AOAC was deeply rooted in verifying new methods against traditional methods. Could not claim our AOAC validation included no confirmation requirement. So there you have it. For all the confusion, sleepless nights, and stress-induced migraines, and I've suffered many of these myself because of this particular issue. We now know who is to blame, and that's our good friends at AOAC. So after that step into history, I'm going to move back into the present here and talk about false positives and non-confirming presumptives. And as I mentioned, these two things are not the same. So I put together a table here, basically kind of highlighting and comparing and contrasting the two. And if you look at false positives and non-confirming presumptives, the first three areas here, in terms of what you see on the instrument, are the same. So you have a positive result, that plus sign. The initial reported result would be presumptive, and the final reported result would be not detected. However, the differences come in the next part here, because for false positives, the target DNA or RNA, or if it's not a PCR test, say an antibody test, the specific antigen is not present at all. In the case of a non-confirming presumptive, it would be present. Okay, the causes are also different. So a false positive could be caused by cross-reactivity with a non-target organism. So for example, the primers or probes in your particular method cross-react with a non-target, or in the case of an antibody-based method, say, you could have a specificity problem with the antibody. You could also have some signal aberrations related to the instrumentation that result in sort of miscalls by the algorithm, which would be considered true false positives. And non-confirming presumptives basically are everything else. So dead cell, DNA, RNA detection, a failure of the confirmation method. And I think it's important for people to realize that there's no perfect diagnostic method, including the cultural confirmation methods that we use. Anybody that tries to tell you there is a perfect detection diagnostic method is wrong. There really is not. You do hear some other terms for these things, so not necessarily for false positives, but for the NCPs, you also hear them called non-culturable presumptives, and you also hear this term detected, not recoverable. But I think it's important that really there are very few that understand really or really appreciate the distinction. And really, in many cases, it really doesn't matter to most people, because they have to be acted on as if they're true positives, irrespective of whether it's a false positive or a non-confirming presumptive. So the question is then, why are we seeing more of these today? Or at least why is there a belief that we're seeing more of these today? And there's a few hypotheses, a few possibilities here, starting from what I consider probably the least common hypotheses you hear to the most common. So the first is that actually we're not seeing, this is not the case. It's actually just been an increase in testing, and there's been more presumptives because of that. So it just feels like there's more non-confirming presumptives. So the data actually does not support that. I certainly have sympathy with that view, and I really wanted to prove that with the data. Was not able to do that, but I just don't think the data currently supports that hypothesis. So the other thing you hear is that PCR methods are less sensitive than they used to be. So the move to single stage enrichment for Listeria and away from the regrow with Salmonella. So you've had fewer presumptives overall, but samples are less dilute going into the PCR, so you get a higher chance of detecting this dead or non-viable DNA or RNA. And this can also complicate confirmations. So there's less selective agents in these single stage enrichments, and so you have more background flora breaking through, making confirmation more difficult. The converse of that, and which is the more popular hypothesis, is that the PCR methods are actually more sensitive than they used to be. And so because of that, you're getting more presumptives overall, and you're getting more non-confirming presumptives because of that. And then the most common hypothesis you hear is that this is mostly related to the detection of dead cells. So non-viable or lethally injured cell DNA or RNA. There's some evidence certainly to that effect. But my question is, why are we seeing this now? This is the question, and not in the past. Why didn't we see this from day one of PCR if this really was going to be an issue? There's some possibilities here. So it could be related to changes in sanitation practices. So there's just more sanitizers, they're different, they're more effective. So there's just more dead cells around. There's increased use of probiotics and or phage products in plant pathogen control programs. Probiotics can complicate conformations for sure. And then some phage products we know can and do trigger PCR presumptive positive results. And of course, this could be a factor in either hypothesis 2 or 3 as well. All right, I'm going to show some data now, share some data. So this first set, this data here is from the EML networks. This is three labs in our network from the first half of 2020, showing all Listeria environmental samples, the total tests run, the number of presumptives, and the presumptive rates broken down by platform technology. So this is the platform technologies are broken down by PCR and its variants, and immunoassays and their variants. And if you look at these numbers, they very much align with our historical averages. Okay, so there does not appear to be an increase does not appear that there's an large increase in presumptives. Therefore, that's probably not the cause of the increase in non-confirming presumptives. And if you look at the percentages, and you see more presumptives by PCR, not surprisingly, and of course the PCR test kit providers say, of course, PCR is more sensitive, so it finds more of these presumptives. But of course, on the other side, you have the immunoassay kit providers can say, well, that makes sense because these PCR presumptives are mostly false positives. So I think both camps here have something to pull out of these numbers. So if you drill down a little bit deeper and you actually look at the PCR data, this is the real-time PCR data at least. Again, this is those same 3 laboratories, the same time frame, the 2020 first half. Again, Listeria species environmental samples, and you actually look at the CQ values of those presumptive results. So even though these are qualitative tests or yes/no tests, you do get sort of some quantitative information in the form of a CQ value, and it's part of the result. And so you can classify these CQ values basically into either strong, medium, or weak, or you can dice them different ways, but I break them down in this way. And I consider a strong presumptive to be anything that's a CQ value of less than 20 to 30. Medium is 30 to 35, and then weak would be 35 to 40 or so. And again, it's for a traditional sort of a 40 cycle type PCR, real-time PCR. So if you look at these strong presumptives, so the ones where you have really low CQ values, 95+% of these are confirming. Okay, and that's sort of the historical norm. It makes a lot of sense, right? There's high numbers. That means there's high numbers of target there, so they should be much more easy to confirm. However, the medium presumptives and the weak presumptives, so these are the higher CQ values, are increasing. And of course, those are more difficult to confirm. And you can see when you get to those very weak presumptives, very small percentage of those actually end up confirming. And because of that, you see the confirmation rate, decreasing, obviously, because these increase of these medium and weak presumptives that aren't confirming, so your confirmation rate is going down. And this is just another way of looking at it, sort of in chart form here. So that's EML wide, at least 3 of our labs. This is one particular client now. This is a client called Client X who gave us permission to share this data without attribution. They had 7 different testing sites, 7 different plant sites. Again, we're looking at Listeria species environmental testing results. And you can look at this is broken down by the percentage in the strong, medium, and weak CQ range. And what you see is that they have 2 outliers that have less strong presumptives, and they have more of these sort of medium and weak presumptives. And if you've been following what I've been saying, we could probably guess what that means in terms of the non-confirmable presumptive rates, because they also happen to have the highest rate of non-confirming presumptives, not surprisingly. There's 2 other sites there that are trending higher, but the sample numbers were much lower, so you can't necessarily say too much there. The sample numbers are still pretty low. Okay, so sorry. So this is basically this is sort of taking that same chart form that I did for the 3 Eurofins labs, now for this Client X, and sort of comparing them. And in this case, it's very similar. You have Client X confirming most of the strong presumptives. So most of those strong presumptives from Client X are confirming, just like most of the strong presumptives from all of our clients are confirming. But they're slightly lower than the Eurofins trend for the medium and weak presumptives, just a little bit lower. And here's a comparison of the 2, looking at, again, this one single client with 7 different production sites versus 3 Eurofins laboratories. And this is the confirmation rates. So finally, I wanted to talk about method changes and the impact of a method change. So you could say, if you have a high rate of non-confirming presumptives, you might say, well, maybe it's the method I'm using. Maybe I'm using a bad method. Maybe what if I try a different method? I will get more confirmed. My presumptives will confirm more often. So this is an example where you had a client moving from method A to method B, and they saw that their so-called false positive rate, their non-conformable presumptive rate, increased with the adoption of method B. And at the same time, however, their testing rate increased significantly, okay, about 137% on a per month basis. So in actuality, what you saw here was that their confirmed positive, their true positive rate grew by 60% on a per test basis. So even though they were seeing more non-conformable presumptives, which is not good, they were not happy about that. They were seeing a lot more true positives, true confirmed positive, which implies that the more sensitive platform here of method B is more frequently finding Listeria DNA from viable and non-viable Listeria, but it also suggests that method A was missing large numbers of true positives. Okay, so you go to a more sensitive method, yes, you get hits, you get additional non-conforming presumptives. That's not good. That really stinks. It's a headache. But you're picking up true positives that were being missed previously. Okay, so I say it's a very good thing overall. And of course, it's easy for me to say, being in the testing lab position. If I were in the production environment, obviously I may not have the same kind of response to that. So which brings us to the blame game. So there's a blame game that happens here. So this was after I gave a talk, actually a webinar last week, and just briefly touched on this topic. And one of the questions that came out after the webinar was I actually quoted it here, and it said, after my presumptive result is not confirmed culturally, what questions do I need to ask the lab to determine if it was a false positive or a non-confirming positive? Then they said, will they be truthful since a false positive represents a laboratory error and a non-confirming positive is not? Okay, so first of all, does a false positive result necessarily indicate a laboratory error? And this is where you get to this argument between kit developers and testing labs. Okay, from our viewpoint as a testing lab, the false positives are more often the result of a deficiency in the method that we're actually using. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this could be like primer probe cross-reactivity or some sort of signal issues with any instrument-based test. Okay, and then you ask the question, can there be a non-confirming presumptive that's the result of a laboratory error? That question implies that all non-confirming presumptives are not the result of laboratory errors. That's not true. There can be some non-confirming presumptives caused by laboratory error. However, for the most part, they're not. They're caused by those reasons that I discussed earlier. So what is the right way to approach the issue? If you have one of these presumptive results that's not confirming and you're worried about the performance of your lab, or you're worried that there might be some lab error, the best thing you can do is request that the lab conduct an out-of-spec investigation. That will make them examine all the stages in the testing process, and they'll have to identify any deviations. And all reputable accredited labs will give truthful answers to these kinds of questions, specifically as it relates to laboratory results. And it's actually a requirement of our accreditation process that we have procedures in place to investigate questionable results. So if you have questions, just ask the lab to do one of these out-of-specification investigations. All right, we'll move into some discussion here and some conclusions, mostly unanswered questions. So for the non-confirming presumptive rates, have they really increased across the board in recent years? Again, the feeling, and my feeling, and the data suggests that yes, they have, but I still have not seen a conclusive data set that says that absolutely for sure is the case. But assuming that there has been a concurrent increase in presumptives that do confirm, is the pain worth it? So the idea is we've got more non-confirming presumptives, but we're finding more of the true positives. But is that pain actually worth it? It's still not clear. There still could be more clarity around what makes a particular method presumptive. Why are some method results considered presumptive but not others? What are the properties of a method that actually qualify it for presumptive status? And then once you're a presumptive status, once you have that status, how long does that last? So is PCR forever going forward to the end of time? A PCR result in food pathogen testing is always going to be presumptive. And then the question is, who decides that? Is it somebody like AOAC, or is it like an IFP or ASM, or is it the regulators? Is it industry, is it testing labs, or is it lawyers, or some combination of all of the above? And then, of course, there's a question around culture, and why is this still the gold standard after all these years? I mean, if you look at this data in one way in this presentation, that suggests there's a good reason for that. If culture was not around, we might have had a lot of been chasing our tails after a lot of things that were not really positives, or really, let's say, risks. And then the question is, what would happen if we actually got rid of the term presumptive positive? We got rid of the term presumptive altogether. And if you have a validated method and you run it and you get a result, you say that's legitimate and you act on it as such. So some of the validating bodies in Europe, like Microval and Nordval, are looking at adopting or changing their method validation strategies to sort of accommodate this approach where rapid methods result will be considered sort of final. So how do we move this? How do we move this forward? Where do we need more work? Well, we have to confirm. We have to do more work characterizing these enrichments that give us these non-conforming presumptives. We really need to definitively answer the question around the presence of target pathogen DNA. There's ways we can do this with microbiome analysis, and we've already done a good bit of this work, but more work still needs to be done. The culture confirmation methods, the reference methods, these can be improved. There is room for improvement here. There have been some changes. We've implemented PCR colony confirmation in our salmonella confirmations, and also for Listeria mono, and also very recently now for Listeria species. This has reduced the turnaround time, and arguably it's improved accuracy, but so far no impact on non-conforming presumptive rates, although it's very early to really say that. And of course, any changes that increase cost or turnaround time, are pretty much impossible to implement in this industry. So are there any other options? Are there other approaches to confirmation? So some other PCR method to confirm, or so for an NGS type approach. And then there's sort of the idea of digital confirmation. So right now you have algorithms that are making these presumptive calls based on the PCR data, the qPCR data. But maybe you could expand that software to consider the totality of the information available about a given sample. So in other words, have the computer ask, does that result actually make sense given all the evidence? So not just look at the raw PCR data, but look at what is the matrix, what's the client history, what's the geography, time of year, all those things could be factors in making that final results call. All right, and that's it. Acknowledgements. There's a lot of people I had to acknowledge here because a lot of people helped with this talk, particularly Pete and George from DuPont. I really appreciated their input and their answering my questions, the back and forth. And the others here, you can read your name. I appreciate your help, and I appreciate everybody's time. And I will take any questions.
All right, thanks so much, Dan. So I'm going to go ahead while questions are getting submitted and just pop up here a question. If you would like someone from Eurofins to follow up with you, select yes, and we will get in contact with you after the webinar. So it looks like our first question that we have for you is, what is the relative frequency of false negatives where PCR results are negative, but the organism is enriched?
So very, very low. I mean, we know false negatives are extraordinarily rare. They do happen. Do we know the exact number? I don't know that we do. There are published numbers. If you look at the sort of the validation data from the major PCR kit manufacturers, some OMA data and others, you can see those rates. I think in our experience, it's very low. However, we also are not confirming. The other thing to recognize is that not all the negative samples are not taken to confirmation, right? So we don't necessarily know how many of those samples might have actually had a pathogen in them, but we just didn't see it. And then because we're not culturing it, there was no way we would ever know that it actually was there. But I think, in my opinion, I think it's widely accepted that it's quite a low rate of false negatives.
Great, thank you. Next question here is there a method to clean up extracellular DNA from dead cells?
Yep. Absolutely, and then this is one of the reasons why the dead cell DNA hypothesis has seemed so so reasonable, because when we treat enrichments with methods that clean up or destroy dead cell DNA prior to testing by PCR, these rates go down, right? So you see these presumptives just going away. Not all of them though, but many do. So certainly the dead cell DNA is a big component of this issue, though I don't think it's 100% the answer.
Great, thank you. Next question here. What is the minimum number of copies of DNA for PCR to detect? Did you say 40,000?
So that 40,000 number is actually a post enrichment. That's the number of cells per milliliter that are needed by that particular method that I was describing, which happened to be the Bax salmonella method. But PCR in general is extraordinarily sensitive, and well-optimized PCR reactions, including basically every kit on the market today, can detect a single copy under ideal conditions. So 1 to 10 copies is sort of the number you typically see. So really, at least in my view, the PCR kits themselves on the market today are very, very similar performance-wise. It's not the PCR chemistry kit instrument part where the differences lie. It's more in the sample prep part. What happens in front of the PCR? How are the enrichments processed to get them into the PCR reaction? What are the actual volumes that are transferred through? What steps are taken? What dilutions happen? All those things impact that final sensitivity, and they can be quite different, even though the PCR itself might be very, very similar and all very, very sensitive.
Great, thank you. The next question here is, what has been the FDA's stance on NCP?
Good question. That's a question I do not know the answer to. I will take that offline, and I will try to do some investigating there. As far as I
Great.
know, there's not an official position there, but I'm happy to be corrected if somebody knows different than I do.
Okay, great. And we will address that one offline. It looks like we are wrapping up here. I've been following the questions in here, but I'll close out with one more here for you, Dan.
Sure.
How should I respond to a non-confirming presumptive?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, and it's one that I get very often from our clients. In my view, I tend to take a very conservative approach. It's easy for me to say that, of course, because I'm in the testing lab. Again, I'm not the guy in the production, with the millions of dollars on the line. But to me, if I have I believe in PCR technology. Again, I'm speaking specifically for PCR. False positive rates are very, very low. The technology is strong. I believe those results. And even if it's a dead cell detection event, in my mind, that means there was live pathogen there at one point. Therefore, there's a risk. So I tend to treat those as real, unless there's a lot of evidence that says they're not.
Okay, great. Thank you. And it looks like I don't see anything else coming in. In case there's any questions that we didn't catch, we will certainly address those with you offline. But again, I want to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be available within 3 business days. And thank you again, Dan, today for your presentation. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks everybody. Really appreciate taking the time.
Thank you.